Welcome back to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum, where we are talking more about the 5 weeks that the Pilgrims spent here on Cape Cod and their interactions with the Wampanoag people who of course have been here for millennia. The Pilgrims have arrived. They've made the Mayflower Compact to kind of establish themselves as a group with leaders and laws. The next thing they have to do is look for an appropriate settlement site. So there are several things that they want to have. The first of which is good agricultural land. They're going to have to feed themselves, so that's really a key factor. They would also like to have a deep harbor, something that would be deep enough to bring in large merchant ships. Of course, they would be loading cargo from the New World, things like timber and furs, onto ships to go back to England. So they want a harbor that's nice and deep for that. They would also like to have a large navigable river leading into that harbor. Again, that's going to make it easier to move trade goods from the interior out onto boats and then sent off to England. So they have, for exploration, 2 smaller boats available to them. One of these is the ship's boat. This is simply an open boat meant to be rowed, which can fit about 16 people, 16 or 20 people, and is simply made for ferrying people between the ship and the shore. So they have this boat available to them. They have a larger boat, which is called a shallop, at their disposal. The shallop is much larger. It can handle probably about 35 people. It can be rowed or sailed. It does have a single mast. Unfortunately, to fit the shallop on the Mayflower, they had to cut it into 4 pieces. So it's going to take a while for the carpenter and his assistant to put it all back together and get it in good working order. So they decide to make a first kind of exploratory trip using the ship's boat. And there are 16 men who set out. They go a little ways along the shore. So here's the Mayflower remaining where it is moored in Provincetown Harbor. And so they're just traveling a little bit along the coast above the harbor, just north of the harbor. They row a bit of ways, they get out and they start walking, and ahead of them in the distance they see 6 native men along with a dog, and as soon as the native people see them, they turn and run. Of course, in an earlier video we talked about the experience that native people here had with Europeans before the Mayflower's arrival. And that history included native people being kidnapped and murdered. The native people turn and run, and this group of men decide to run after them. And in one of the writings, I believe it's in a collection of writings known as Mort's Relation, they talk about, well, we ran after them for a distance of 10 miles. So that we could talk to them and perhaps trade with them, but also because we were wondering whether there might be more of them in hiding waiting to attack us. And of course you can't really have those 2 things together. If you're chasing someone for 10 miles, it's not usually because you're wait, I just want to talk. From the native side of things, word would have spread very quickly across the Cape and into the rest of Wampanoag territory that there was a large group, a sizable group of Englishmen with weapons chasing a much smaller group of native people. They continue on their journey the next day, and they find a mound of sand, and they decide to kind of dig into it and see what it might be. So they clear away some of this sand, and there seem to be layers of sand and very finely woven mats. As they're kind of opening this mound up, they find a bow and arrow and the arrows are starting to rot or decay. And they figure out pretty quickly that this is probably a grave. And they decide, no, we should put everything back, don't touch it, because I believe they say it would be odious in the sight of the native people if we disturb their graves. So they go a little further, they see another mound. This one looks sort of larger and fresher. Their curiosity gets the better of them. They dig into it and they find a very large quantity of dried corn stored in 2 very big baskets. Now at this point, the group has a decision to make. So they've arrived at the beginning of November. They are short on provisions because all of their delays leaving England, the problems with the second ship, the Speedwell, all of that time they were eating up their own provisions. So there was about a month before they actually finally left England for good and headed for North America, when they had to eat their own provisions. So they've arrived low. They really don't have any fresh food. Some people are probably developing scurvy. There's already some kind of what sounds like an upper respiratory infection starting to spread. They talk about people having vehement coughs. Plus, obviously, they have no shelter to go to. They have no buildings of any kind, and winter is fast upon them. So they debate at length about this, and they finally decide that they should take as much of the corn as they can carry. And they decide that as soon as we're able to talk with the native people, we will pay them back for the corn that we've taken. So that sort of rounds out their first excursion. By the time of their second excursion, the shallop is ready. So a much larger group of people set out. I believe that there are 30 men. And they're again exploring a little bit further along the bay side of the Cape. When they came into Provincetown Harbor, they thought they saw a large river in the distance, so they want to see if they can find that. They make their way there. Today it's what we call the Pamet River, and it was really kind of, it wasn't the kind of river they were looking for. It was really kind of more of a tidal estuary, and not kind of a large navigable river that would go from several miles inland that would allow them to then easily transport trade goods. So that kind of is a disappointment. They decide at this point that they are going to go back to the place that they've named Corn Hill, the place where on their first excursion they found the cache of corn. They decide to go back and they decide to take the rest of the corn. They also come across another mound, which they again decide to dig into. Pretty quickly they realize this is a grave. But whereas on the first excursion they decided not to disturb the grave, this time their curiosity gets the better of them. And they dig into it. They find the remains of 2 people. One is an adult who still has light-colored hair attached to the skull. And the much smaller skeleton of a small child. There's no way of knowing really who these people were, but since the adult had light hair, there is speculation that this was an earlier explorer. There were any number of English explorers who'd spent a season or 2 along Cape Cod, and so this could simply be one of those people. So at this point, there are a number of grave goods, and they decide to take what they called the best things. They go a little bit further along, and they come across a Wampanoag house, which is called a wetu. It's made from a structure of bent saplings, and those are covered over by very, very finely woven mats. There isn't anyone in the Wetu when they find it, but there is a freshly killed head of a deer. So someone has been there relatively recently. And in the Wetu, they find a number of objects, very beautifully woven baskets, fine pottery, wooden bowls, a whole variety of kind of household goods. And once again here, they decide that they are going to take away with them the prettiest things. So this is how their second excursion wraps up. They go back to the Mayflower and they really have a decision to make at this point. Should they simply pick one of the areas they've seen already, or should they continue looking for a site that really might suit their colony better? They are all acutely aware of the weather and the illness that is spreading among them. So after much discussion, they decide, okay, we'll make one more excursion. And there were two members of the crew, the two pilots from the Mayflower who had actually been to New England before. And one of them recalled a very large harbor to the west that also had a very large river leading into it. They say, okay, we'll keep exploring further to the west, and in any case, if we find this large harbor, we're not going to go any further than that. So they set out. The first night, the weather turns horribly bad. They talk about water freezing to their clothing. As they're going along in the shallop, they're constantly hitting sandbars, so they're having to get out and wade through the water and pull the ship along. So they're wet, they're very, very cold. So they make that first night. They make camp and they say, tomorrow morning we're going to go west and see if we can find that large harbor. The next morning, they wake up, they say their prayers, they're just about to start preparing breakfast, when suddenly there's a hail of arrows. Now, of course, we only have the English perspective on this event that we generally refer to as the first encounter. We don't have any written Wampanoag details of what happened. But from the English writings, we know that there were arrows and musket balls exchanged. Apparently, no one was injured. At one point during the conflict, one of the Englishmen with his musket takes aim at a man that they think might be the Wampanoag's leader. And at this point, the Wampanoag turn and run and retreat. So, again, this is an event that we generally refer to as the first encounter, and you can go to this spot in Truro, which is called First Encounter Beach. In lots of ways, this is a misnomer. The Wampanoag people had encountered any number of English before, but this was sort of the first encounter for the Wampanoag and the group of people who came aboard the Mayflower. So after the conflict has passed, they get in the boat, they start to sail west, and the weather turns very, very bad. The rudder of the shallop breaks, and a little while later the mast breaks as well. They are in real danger of sinking, and suddenly they see a bit of land in the distance. So they manage to make it over to this spot of land, which is actually an island, and there they all disembarked and took their rest for an evening. This island is now named for the first Englishman who stepped on it. His name last name was Clark, and we now know that as Clark's Island in Plymouth Harbor. The next day, they make repairs to their shallop, and they go ashore and explore a bit. So They thought that they had seen a river leading into this harbor. Unfortunately, when they get closer and take a better look, it's really kind of more of a brook than an actual stream. There are not any native people. They don't see any native people, but they know that there have been native people there in the past because they see the old stubble from cornfields. But there are no native people there now, and they ultimately decide, okay, this is the place where we will set our colony. This was not a place that met all their original criteria. However, given the fact of nothing on Cape Cod has really seemed to be what they want in a settlement site either, and they've just had a rather nasty encounter with the native people on the Cape, I think they decide that this is really why this particular spot, which we today know as Plymouth, will be the site of their colony.